Okay. Hi, everyone. It's good to see you all. We're doing a live stream here today. We've got some amazing folks joining us today. Justin McAfee of Collapse Curriculum is here with us. I'm Max Wilbur and write Biocentric. And then we've got Margie from Radically Local. And Margie and Justin and myself have exchanged some notes and some emails and such over the course of maybe going back over a year or more now, kind of in dialogue a bit between the different but parallel work that we've been doing. And but Margie's on the other side of the world in Australia, and Justin and I are here in the Western United States, and so we wanted to get on this live stream and just talk about our work. So Margie, thanks for joining first. And second, would you mind telling us a little bit more about just your background, your bio, how you got to where you're at and doing the work that you're doing now, just to get the conversation started?
Certainly. And look, it's an absolute honor to be here with you guys on these live streams. I've really enjoyed watching your live streams evolve over time, with a little bit of envy, I have to say. So it's great to actually finally join you. My background, I have been pretty much an activist for most of my working life. And in many ways, I come from an activist childhood as well, although my parents might not have seen it that way, but really that's what they were. They moved out of the traditional mainstream, and we lived in an intentional commune for most of my childhood. So my world has always been a little bit outside the norm, and I got involved in the normal run of local campaigns early in my career, I guess you would call it. Then, as a mature age student, took myself to university, studied international relations, and got a PhD in international relations related to international environmental negotiation and law, and did that work for 35, 40 years. So I'm not a youngster. And then the Black Summer wildfires hit Australia. And in the midst of that, I was traveling. I used to travel a lot. I used to be in and out of the country probably 5 or 6 times a year to various different international negotiation processes. And I flew out in November of 2019, and the plane flew directly over the wildfires that were at that point burning on the eastern side of Australia, and the smoke plume and cloud plume from that was just breathtakingly frightening. I mean, the plane was never in danger, but it was just the scale hit me really hard. And then my husband and I live in a rural community, so everyone here are firefighters. And by December, I was back here, and the fire had started in our region. So we were both out on the fire ground from that point through. And in very early January, we lost most of our property. So all of the buildings, all of the fencing, all of the planting, everything was gone. And in the wake of that, I really had a kind of a shock to the system about what this all means, and how it's not really even realistic to suggest that climate change is an issue for the future. That it became very apparent to me that it was panning out in lives, human and non-human, in real time right now. And so I left my job, and I mean, we had to rebuild, so that was going to be a many-year process as well. But shifted my focus to climate chaos advocacy, and that's where I'm at now. I still do work in my old domain of international relations, but it's very sidelined now to this more climate chaos space. Yeah,
Mm.
that's me.
Fascinating. So, if you don't mind, I'm gonna pry a little bit more because I'm curious. So you
Mm.
mentioned, like, the environmental
Mhm.
negotiation stuff. I took an
Mhm.
environmental negotiation class when I was in undergrad,
Mhm.
and it was a fascinating topic to me, albeit one that I was already very radical and really
Mm.
revolutionary at the time, even as a young person, and
Yeah.
so I didn't have really any faith even at that point in government institutions, in corporations, and so the whole idea of negotiating with these bodies or within these bodies was, um, not something that I was particularly drawn to, but I found the class fascinating. One thing that really stuck out to me at the time was just they told us, in order for negotiation to go anywhere, then there must be some overlap in values, right? You have to have
Mhm.
some
Mhm.
shared realities that you can build upon. Um,
Yeah.
and so I guess I'm just curious as to that side of your history. Were you involved in climate negotiations, or was this biodiversity related, or what sort of stuff?
Both, actually,
Okay.
both. So I never attended the big climate COPs. They're really, how do I put this? Aside from the governments that are turning up that have the power to make or break deals, everyone else who's there is there for show, mostly, right? The climate COPs are an enormous machine that consume a huge amount of energy, and off them comes an enormous amount of fundraising effort. So the attendance at climate COPs is for everyone else except for the core negotiators is a little bit of a sideline. So I was never actually part of that, but I did do climate negotiations that were in allied bodies, um, where everything is a lot smaller. And that whole point of what you're saying is core. It's the negotiator's role is to find that common ground, and I loved it. I loved doing it because there's something in me that really enjoys the challenge of figuring out where that will be, where that common ground will be, and then it's the art of words, trying to figure out how to leverage the things you need into that common ground. But especially in the biodiversity space, which is where most of my work was focused, and very often was focused for um, local communities. So I would be the negotiator or the advocate on behalf of local communities who didn't have the capacity to be in that space, and the NGOs that I worked for enabled that to be able to be transposed in. Um, the 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 costs to the compromise can be enormous, and then you go to all of this trouble of working out that compromised space, that shared space, only to find that governments then won't implement it when they get back into their home turf. Because, and here's something that is very poorly understood, I think, in the wider environment movement, but also just in the general public. Absolutely nothing that happens in international space has any standing at all until it is implemented in law in domestic spaces. So, sovereign governments are the highest authority in the world. There is nothing above them. Zero, nothing. So when they turn up into a UN meeting, they're all there as like a big board of directors. There isn't anyone that's a judge and jury above them, or there is no controlling influence above them. So anything they say and do in there is purely intent. It's not action until they actually do it then in their domestic space. So until they take it from that international space back into domestic law. That was really frustrating. And I have to say that in the last 10 years of my time doing that work, I was really losing faith
Mm.
in the ability of the system to change. I really still believe in a multilateral world. I believe in the idea of consensus and shared responsibility and agreement between peoples in different regions. I don't believe in a bordered world where we're at constant edge or war with everyone else that's on the outside of our border, which is the world that we're heading into right now. Um, and that saddens me, um, but I don't think that the multilateral system that exists in the world now has actually done very much at all, which is a rough one. So after the fires, and I'm standing there in basically an ash ground of our property. Um, I was hit by how profoundly a failure my whole career had been, and then also this climate change um, lens just got dropped away. Um, yeah, I'm doing something different now. I'm really not going to invest my time in that because I won't go so far as to say it's a lie, but I don't think that it's a truth anymore.
Mm.
Mm.
Yeah, yeah. I think many people have similar experiences. I worked briefly with a woman a number of years ago. Sarah Guernsey Silverberg was her name, and she was a one-time climate negotiator. She did go to
Mm.
the COP conferences. She's an attorney
Mm.
now, I think mostly former attorney. But I believe that she represented some of the small island nations, or she
Yeah,
was part of a team helping to represent them at these. And
yeah,
she also just quit after I don't know how long of doing it, but years, I believe, because she was just burned out by the reality of the situation. And of course, many of you two, and many of the viewers probably know this, but the small island nations, this is something that I've tried to say repeatedly in my writings. The
mm,
small island nations have released these statements saying that 350 parts per million of carbon in the atmosphere is a death sentence for the small island states. Um,
yeah,
and it's just fascinating politically because what's seen as a viable target, something to work towards in the global north, is by these people who are living on the literal frontest of front lines of global warming.
yeah,
It's a death sentence for them, and people who are actually seeing those impacts of the climate chaos, most directly are not certainly operating under the illusion that this is a future crisis, right? It's been a present thing
yeah,
for a long time. Justin, do you want to jump
absolutely.
in? Or Margie, go ahead. Sorry.
No, no, it's fine. I'm just going to try and deal with my lighting here while Justin gives some wisdom. Jeff, turn this on.
Yeah, it's really remarkable because obviously our culture has this I don't know if it's a new religion, but it's the now the dominant religion is the economy.
Uh,
And if you think about what religions do, a lot of times you venerate what you worship, and you have to make sacrifices for what's right. And for the economy, those folks that live on those islands, those are sacrifices we're willing to make, which is grotesque. Let me be clear, but that's the attitude I think that essentially comes down when they're looking at what's the consequences, or what's a goal for us to try to meet when it comes to the climate. We're not looking at what's going to help the most people, or help people at all. Is we're looking at what's going to be viable for the economy in the long run, and that's all really a bunch of bullshit anyways, because at some point,
Huh.
how does the economy do when everything starts to tank anyway? So it's more about the short-term benefits of the economy. Uh, and as far as international law goes, I just wanted to add that it seems like that's the case. There might be a little bit more teeth with some of these things if the countries have adopted some of these rules, but when it comes to war crimes and ethnic cleansing, or it just seems like none of that stuff ever gets enforced either. Just another example of
Yeah.
um, what
Mm,
you were saying, and certainly
mm,
when it comes to anything like climate change, it's going to be way
mm.
less effective.
Mm.
And even with war crimes, it's just not effective.
Absolutely. And if I could just chime in on that, two things that jump into my mind. We should all absolutely, without any shadow of a doubt, put the Pacific Islands and in fact, mostly the Pacific Islands, but all the small island states on hero pedestals. I mean, honestly, these countries have punched so far above their weight. Their delegations are tiny, and they have held the line for decades and decades. What's facing them is existential, and it has been for a long time. Um, they are the true champions of so much of this clusterfuck. Really, I mean, they are amazing.
Yeah.
Um, but the other thing that I would say too about international law is that there was a time when international law did have teeth, right? When the UN was first formed, so in the first decade, the 60s and 70s, and then the very early parts of the 80s, there was amazing, amazing steps being made, and a lot of the fundamentals of our legal systems that we exist under now were created through that time. All the big, amazing documents came out through that time as well. But from the 90s onwards, it's just lost all of its punch. And mostly that's because of business. Big business has gotten in. Big business now has a seat at pretty much every single table in international negotiation. They are by far the most formidable physical opponent in the room to any legal progress. Um, it's not just Elon Musk with his trillions. This has been going on now for 40 years. So yeah, they have so much sway in the world beyond even what people on the face of it think.
Mm.
It's a big, big thing, and it's a good reason to be turning to activism at a at a more local level. I think we have to move away from trying to negotiate with them, and we need to undermine them.
Yeah, so speaking of that, Margie, your publication is called Radically Local. Could you tell us a little bit
Mm.
about, why you started it and what it centers around?
Sure. So, Radically Local is born out of a book that I actually wrote just in the days after the wildfire. And this wildfire, I live on an island, small island, and this wildfire decimated a third of our island, total 89 homes out of a population of 4,500 people. So it was a big deal for our community. I wrote a I wrote a book about our recovery. And what I recognized in that process was that the community felt utterly disempowered in the lead up to and then in the aftermath of the fire, that everything was centered on government making decisions about us and for us and funneling us in directions that were not our choosing and were not our choice and were not good for nature. They weren't good
Mm.
for the farmers. They weren't good for any of us. And so I, that book came out, and then I wanted to keep writing in that space. And so started writing about the process that my smaller um, immediate community in that larger community was doing around our own food sovereignty. Because keep in mind, we were burnt to the ground, so we were completely ash in this region here. There was just literally nothing left. And then a few months later, COVID hit, and suddenly we were all, constrained to not being able to travel anywhere. We couldn't buy supplies more at the kind of scale that you do when you live remotely. We had to buy like 1 liter of milk that's like 1 pint of milk a day, which is crazy when you have to travel 75 kilometers to get that liter of milk. And it was just, we were really in shock. We couldn't believe that this was happening to us, putting aside the whole business about the disease itself. It was more the government's reaction and the inability to see at a community scale. So we started rebuilding ourselves outside the system, illegally in many cases. There's a lot of things that we're doing that are technically not legal anymore, but we're doing them anyway because it's better for our community and it's better for our future. That's what Radically Local is about. It's about finding your way to survive what's coming down the pipe, regardless of what the system tells you should be doing, and being a bit brave about it as well, and that bravery isn't only standing on the front lines of a blockade or chaining yourself to a tree or being at a protest. Bravery can also be saying no to the law, and no, I'm not going to do this because it's not good for me. It's not good for my society. I'm not buying into that whole thing of don't pay your taxes and don't pay your bills and all of that. I'm not meaning that. I'm meaning you need to work out how inside your community context you can create something that can sustain you all collectively, regardless of what the system tells you is right or wrong. Radically local.
Mm. And so, as part of this rebuilding process, it seems like you have gotten into, or maybe you were into before, growing a lot of food, right? That's a big part of
Yeah.
this process.
Yeah. Well, and that's because that's our most immediate threat for us here, fire and food. So I was already a food grower before this all happened. We live on a farm. Despite all of my international work, I still had our own garden, and I worked from home intentionally so that I could continue all of that kind of work. That's been a part of my life for a very long time. This is the life I grew up from as well. But post the fires, we started trialing different systems for how we could grow collectively across all of our spaces, and also looking at what market gardeners do and their techniques, how they work, and then working out actually that their techniques are wonderful, but they won't work for community growing because they grow for a market. So they grow to sell a lot of carrots or a lot of lettuces or a lot of 3 or 4 crops. But if you're trying to feed a community, you have to learn how to grow enough food that sustains them for 12 months of the year. And that can't just be lettuces or carrots. It has to be, a whole diet. And so we've been working our way into this system, which now we're working probably in our 2.5 year now, I'd say. Where across 6 separate properties, we have 40 crops, 39 to 40 crops that we're growing and harvesting every fortnight to feed 22 people at this point, and that will probably expand. I think we'll maybe top out around 30 people, including our own properties. There's a lot of food. It's a real lot of food, and it's meant we've had to learn how to do a lot of things that you don't do as a home gardener, and just about how to even harvest at that scale and have things stay fresh enough to be able to distribute. Um, it's a big commitment, but it's also pulled the community tighter together, which is a nice side effect.
Mm, mm.
Finding harmony, which isn't always apparent, I can tell you.
Yeah, yeah,
I
absolutely.
know
Well,
there's a lot of people I've talked to who have that's what they struggle with, is that community aspect. Like,
mm,
who
Mm,
could I work with and growing food, and they don't feel like maybe that's the best route for them to take. But it
mm,
sounds like I know you wrote that article about the hunger gap, and
mm.
you talk about different ways in which having all of those elements, because if one person has a struggle, like they get ill, then who's going to fill in those gaps?
Yeah.
So it seems like that the element of having multiple people really is important, even though it may be tough for some people.
Absolutely. And also recognizing too that doing any of this solo is a hiding to nothing. You just can't. It's too big and too much. And I think that this relates as well to any form of activism. I think
mm,
you really have to find a group of people that you can work with, and you might not even agree with them all the time. That it's funny because in our little community, we've got a very diverse, quite broad church of belief sets. There's even a pro-Trump person in our midst, which I find amazing in Australia, but there you go. Uh, but it's finding the people, it's finding that ground where agreement can be formed regardless of the bigger mess of what's going on in the world. And agreeing to not talk about some things if it means that you can progress the greater good together. So I really caution in all of my writing, don't go looking for friends. Friends are really important, right? That's the project that of your life that should be central to you. But that is not the project of activism and being a local radical. Being those roles, you need to find ways of getting on with a group of people who are important to you geographically. That's for me, that's not a truth for everywhere in the world, but for me, that's a really, really important skill. And it's atrophied in our society. We don't know how to do this anymore because it's too easy to cherry pick the people that we want to associate with. We've got infinite ability now to be in contact with like minds. Like, look at this, the fact that here you guys are in the United States, I'm in Australia, and we're having a real time face to face conversation. This is great and I love this, but that can't be the way that your life is entirely constructed. You do have to figure out how to be um, cooperative with people who are geographically
mm.
close to you. And that's hard. That's
Yeah.
really hard.
Yeah, it reminds me, Margie, this is maybe a strange connection to make, but it reminds me, I don't know if you've ever seen the film The Wind That Shakes the Barley.
No.
It's an incredible film. It's about Irish revolutionaries and the struggle against the English colonial rule. And
Right.
the beginning of the film starts out with these guys out on the field, out on the pitch, and they're hurling. They're playing the game of hurling, which
Hmm.
is an ancient Irish game, I believe, right? And Justin probably knows this history much better than I do because he's got a lot of Irish ancestry. But the film, it's very deliberate that it starts there. It's not just sort of a scene that's thrown in for ambiance or something like that. It starts there
Mm.
because the connections that were formed on the pitch, doing this physical sport that involved teamwork and good communication and planning and training and preparation, that led
Mhm.
directly to the formation of, what eventually became an underground sort of military, but also political movement, a social movement that swept through
Yeah.
the nation and and rose up against the occupation. And that choice is very deliberately made, as is
Mhm.
everything in that film, down to the title. And the significance of
Mhm.
the title is, that these people who are fighting against the British, they would often carry barley in their pockets, um,
Wow.
as a traveling food. And if they would be
Mhm.
shot and killed, um, then they might be buried or they might not be, but barley would grow where they died.
Wow.
And so the wind that shakes the barley is, if I'm not wrong, Justin, right? It's an old song that was written, a very poetic, beautiful, tragic song that was written about those who fell, essentially fighting against the occupation. But, I think there's a parallel there between what you're describing with what you're describing, Margie, in terms of the importance of the physical, the geographical connections and working with the people
Mm.
where you are. And I've often found that very same thing to be true in political work. I think often
Mhm.
people are looking for people who agree exactly with everything that they do. And you can find those people
Mm.
on the internet, but it's one way in
Mm.
which the internet has been incredibly destructive to our organizing, because in the
Yeah.
past, we had to work with the people who lived where we did, regardless of whether or not we agreed with them entirely. And that was an
Yeah.
incredibly valuable process that involved challenging your own assumptions, challenging other people's assumptions,
Mhm.
having fights sometimes, working it out, figuring out how to communicate with each other across those differences, and coming to positions of compromise or recognition that, hey, maybe we can't actually work together because of this difference.
Yeah.
We need to work separately. Um,
Yeah.
yeah, and I think there's a big parallel there. My friend, I don't know if you know Kara Huntermoon, but she's a friend locally, has a permaculture farm. She also writes on Substack, and she is very much doing similar work to you in terms of food sovereignty, relocalization, food security in the face of climate catastrophe. And
Mm.
that was one thing that she wrote about recently, was the difficulty of community. She lives on
Mm.
land with, I think, 10 or 20 people. And, she said, people are hard in community. They're really hard. They get on your nerves. They annoy the hell out of you. And
Yep.
sometimes you're the problem. Sometimes I
Yeah.
really
Yeah.
appreciate that she put that in there. Sometimes you're the one
Yeah.
who's full and you may not be aware of it. Or maybe you are, but you can't stop for whatever reason. Um,
Yeah.
and and it's very much the reality in the political work that I go out not looking for friends, although it's always a bonus when you find a friend, but looking to develop political relationships. And that's, in a way, that's just a neighbor relationship.
Full agreement.
So
Yeah.
I'm curious,
But
Margie. I'm curious. One of the questions that Justin and I got after our last live stream, somebody was commenting and talking about how, they agreed with what we were saying, and most of the people watching the stream probably agreed. And the person was asking the question, how do you deal with people who don't agree with you? How do you actually approach those situations? So I'm wondering if maybe you could dive into that a little bit more. I don't know what sort of the spectrum of political opinion you're dealing with is. Sounds like you've got a pro-Trump person. So I don't know whether you're dealing with the full spectrum from like global warming isn't real to
Yep.
to people who are like you. I don't
Yep.
know in terms of, cultural, ethnic diversity, class diversity, wealth, educational background, where people were raised, whether they're immigrants in the community or not, who are you dealing with? What's that spectrum and how do you navigate those challenges?
Okay. So, as is the case in almost every rural farming community across the Western world, right? I think this is a truism for Europe, North America, Australia, um, New Zealand. Farming communities are politically conservative. They are very slow to move in their views about the world, and I think there's some good reason behind that. I think it's about having received knowledge from a generation before you that has worked, and therefore you're reluctant to change until there's a really good reason, because your scale is a seasonal, annual scale. It's not as fast as the world of our internet and
Mm.
information absorption that now is part of most white collar work in the world. So I have a little bit of sympathy for the conservative nature of it, but it's deep frustration, a really deep frustration, because they're also very, very difficult to shift.
Mm.
So we have that as the kind of the core community. There are a lot of what we call incomers, and Jeff and I are part of that. So people who've moved here, having had other lives and other professions, moved into this community. We come with all of that diversity that comes with coming from different parts of the world. There is cultural diversity. There's a bit in our community, but not as much as, say, you would see in a city. That's mostly just because of the economics of where we are and the fact that there aren't that many jobs, truthfully. There is a huge strata of economic diversity in our community as well, from probably people who are quite wealthy, on paper at least, if probably not monetarily on a day-to-day basis, but on paper, if they were to sell their properties, they would be considered wealthy in our community anyway, right through to people who are way below the poverty line, like crazy below the poverty line, subsistence livers. Education is pretty diverse as well. People who have left school quite early to go and work on the land, through to people who've done all the way through higher education. So, it's a decent snapshot of Western society, I would say. On a political spectrum, we've got everything from me, who's probably the furthest left in terms of my views of the world, all the way through to MAGA, pro-Trump, climate change is a hoax, and a couple of bonkers sort of hang-ons from the old QAnon conspiracy days thrown in there as well, which is always interesting. So I find the way that you deal with this is the same way that I used to deal with it in my international work. You got to go and look for where there is a point of agreement, and you work from that.
Mm.
Everyone has stuff that they agree about. We may disagree on the big ticket items of life, religion or politics or whatever, but there will be points where we all do agree. And for our community, it was about being in control of our food. That was a really easy way to become completely apolitical and build something that was apolitical. You go back to the movie that you've just discussed, and that movement that began, that would have been apolitical back then as well. That it would have been. We see it now through a political lens, but at that time, that would have been about that community's survival. They wouldn't have seen it on a political spectrum. It would have been about survival. People can be pulled together, and then after you've done that for a little while, and you don't try and convert everyone to the one worldview, you just convert everyone to this one community view, you'd be surprised actually what then happens. I've had those climate change skeptics come and sit down with me in my wash and pack shed for, hours and want to talk about climate change. They've initiated the conversation. It's interesting. how it can happen when people feel safe,
Mm.
and that diversity can still coexist inside that safety. But it is really tough, because people will say things that offend you. They will do things that offend you, and you have to learn to harden up to it all and not take it personally, which is
Mm.
rough. It's rough,
Mm.
because you are face to face with these people on a regular basis. But again, I say it's a skill that we used to have and it's atrophied. When we all lived in villages, we were very adept at this. We had to be because it's how a village survived. But we don't anymore because we're too many people with too many choices, condensed into areas. Now it's easy to find your like-mindeds, and people gravitate to that, and they've stopped learning how to coexist with difference and division.
Mm.
I don't know. Did I just answer that, or did I go off on a tangent? I think
No,
I
you
might have gone
did.
off on a
You did.
tangent.
No, you did quite well, I think, and it reminds me of some of my organizing work. For example,
Mm,
organizing against the Thacker Pass lithium mine in northern Nevada. It's a very rural
mm,
agricultural area, and so you have these different sort of blocks or elements within the community. Sort of the mainstream um, of the white settler population there, which makes up the bulk of the number of people who live in the area, are um, either work in agriculture, some of them work in mining. They have certainly have family connections to the mining industry, friends and family members who work in the industry. Um, but they've also, there's this long-term farming perspective. uh, the average voter there is definitely a Trump voter. Um,
mm.
but within that, you have a lot of variance. From one woman who told me very seriously that she believed that women shouldn't have the right to vote. Um,
Ooh,
to I thought she was joking at first because I'd never heard somebody
yeah.
say that. Um, let al- you know, ser- as a serious
Mm,
idea.
mm,
But if you've been following like Pete Hegseth, the Department of War, his pastor,
mm,
who's sort of this rising star on the conservative Christian right, that's a position that he takes, and it is becoming increasingly popular among. Um, I don't know whether they're evangelicals or what, but certain wings of far right Christians in the U.S. Um, and then on the other end of the spectrum, you have these sort of uh, libertarian cowboy types who hate big government and probably are anti-war in the in the what
mm,
was it? Is it like Ron Paul type way or the libertarian way? Just want to have their guns and live out in the desert and uh, probably hate big business almost as much as I do, but also hate the government and um, like go to Burning Man, go to the Burning Man
yeah.
festival, and yet are like, just people are complex, I guess, is the point that I was making. And
Mm,
and then there were the indigenous communities, which again are very much not monolithic. The indigenous communities
yeah.
in these areas, there are quite a few, the native people who work in the mines and are very pro
Mhm,
mining and very oriented towards making as much money as they can and getting a nice car and a nice house. And then there are others who are very traditional in their orientation towards the land and ceremony and more connected with hunting and gathering. And then and are usually opposed to mining as well. Sometimes there's overlaps between that, where you'll get these people who are very culturally, these native people in these communities who are very culturally active and tied into their language and so on, but also work for the mining industry, or work
mm,
for these extractive industries and are very much supportive of that. Um, so people are complex, obviously, and you kind of have to approach each person as an individual and figure out who they are and what they believe and what influenced them and how they were raised and where they came from. before you can really have a good sense um, of how to move forward in a sense. But
Yeah,
but
absolutely.
yeah, that was something at Thacker Pass, was trying to figure out how to build a political movement, build an alliance between people with these different perspectives. We always took sort of a principled stance that we were going to be honest about what we believed, and we weren't going to
Hmm.
hide what we really felt about situations. But I wasn't there to fight with that woman about whether or not women should have the right to vote in that meeting.
Mm.
I I
Mm.
strongly believe differently than she does, but there would have been no value whatsoever to be created by having an argument with her in that context. And I feel like people have been trained so
Mm.
badly by the internet, where it's like as soon as somebody says something that I disagree with, I have to fight them on it.
Yeah.
And there's a time and a place uh, for that, but I don't think that that time is every time, and that place is every place. I think there's
Mm.
a time to just shut your mouth and listen, and
And to listen to what's behind that view as well that you might not agree with, right? And it
mm,
doesn't mean you have to change your view, but just to harvest a little bit of information about why that complex person has
mhm,
been drawn to this
yeah,
abhorrent position. And you will tackle it at some point. If you see her again in another
mm,
context, you'll probably have an argument about it. And that's
mm,
good and fair and as humans should conduct themselves. But you're spot on. We shouldn't be doing it every single time because you just drive everyone away and the wedge becomes too large.
mm,
The gap is too big then to be able to pull together.
yeah, yeah, absolutely. Justin, sorry.
Yeah, I was thinking as you were talking about Ireland and its history, and they certainly had a coalition of people who were far that wanted the new Ireland to be like communist or socialist
Mm.
or whatever, to very conservative Catholic, religious um, folks in Ireland as well. But the one thing they could agree on was that the sovereignty of the land should belong to the native Irish people, not to
Yeah.
a foreign empire. And that brings to mind Vietnam, and that's essentially. I would make a comparison, but also contrast it because they were also predominantly farmers, and they didn't agree on everything. In fact, there were different ethnic groups in Vietnam, and uh, the mostly what they agreed on was getting rid of a foreign control. So they
Mm,
Mhm.
they found that one thing that they could really get on board with. The only problem, as it turns out, I think in the end for them was that they decided on a one party system where dissent was not allowed. So I think that's a lesson, because I don't think that's the way we get out of this thing or whatever it is, whether it's getting through climate change or other ecological disasters or fighting the more of the global capitalist hegemony or hegemony. That's what I say. Uh, it's not going to be through one party rule and not allowing dissent. So
Mm.
yeah, we have to figure out what is this one thing, and maybe you can speak to this, Margie. It sounds like for you, it was for folks there, it was kind of having food sovereignty, and I wonder if
Yeah.
is there a larger piece that we could coalesce around that would allow for dissent among about all other things, but we're looking at what the survival of our species and the planet. I don't know.
Mm. The survival of species in the planet is a really hard nut because the whole climate debate has been so poisoned by so much falsehood that it's really, really difficult, I find, to get over it. Um, and also, I would say too that people, in general, I'm not just meaning people who are uh, outside the climate space, but in general, people have become too easily swayed by what they read in the news, and they now lack the skills for critical assessment themselves. Like, I just find that across society,
Mhm.
it's perplexing. I see it in Substack comments. It's everywhere. I'm not sure if I'm answering your question right, and so please stop me and put it again if I'm going off on a tangent. But food security for me was something that I could see was completely neutral in our community. Um, there is a bigger thing, a bigger discussion that we have to have about water security here, about um, fighting the next fire, because there will be another big fire here. We just know it. All of us know it, and you don't even have to believe in climate change here to know it. It's just we we have experienced it, so we can see the pattern of when it will come again. Because this is a fire landscape that's now, and I'd love to talk to you guys about this on another day, but it's a fire landscape where fire has been suppressed and constrained, and so now fire threatens at a greater scale than it historically did. Um, because fire can't do what fire would normally or would naturally do. As a community, I think we're pretty tuned into that, because we're physically living in that space all the time. Uh, we will start to have these conversations, and they are starting to happen around the edges of the food sovereignty discussion. But what I focused on first was just trying to get that buy-in to working together first, and build some confidence that we could do it outside the system. We can do this outside the system, and we are doing it outside the system. And the confidence that built is allowing those other discussions to start to happen. I kind of want someone else to step forward and lead them, um, for all of the reasons that I wrote in those 2 essays. I think that it's a good thing if there's a diverse group of people bringing in their wisdom into a whole, rather than it always coming from 1 or 2 people. Like, if Jeff and I are constantly being the people who are always at the pushing front edge, that's a danger for the system.
Mhm.
Um, but then when you then look at a bigger, it's as easy, 'cause I know it's comparatively easy in a small community that's been hit by a very large scale disaster. Um, it's much harder when you then are looking at a region where you're talking about hundreds of thousands of people. Um, but I
Mm,
still feel like there are a bunch of neutral spots where you can start to build coalitions, and then inside those, not coalitions, that's the wrong phrase, where you can start to build groups of people who want to do something together and share that trust in each other, to then have a bigger discussion about how we
Mm.
bring down the system, which
Mhm.
really is what we have to do. We have to bring it all down. This has to collapse, because if it doesn't, and you guys have talked about this at length, if it doesn't, um, it's going to be so much worse, just so much worse. Uh, and it's
and
going to be so much
can
worse
I ask a
quite soon, you know? Yeah.
I just wanted to ask a follow-up question too. Do you find, 'kay, I would call, um, I would call it the, neoliberal, hegemony. But
Mm,
do you find I find that here that, the people across the political spectrum, people on the right as well as people on the left, see, like, an overbearing, like, corporate power over politics and over food and over all kinds of things like pharmaceuticals. Do you
mhm,
find that that is also the case?
mm. Yeah. Yeah. And my European friends say the same thing. So I think that what you what you're seeing in the US, I think, is echoing out to the rest of the Western world in a view that's shared by the general public at large. Maybe people can't articulate it very well. That I think is a thing. Like they feel like there's just this enormous weight of a system that's bearing down on them, and they don't really understand it. They don't understand how this can work. Why is it that, you know, X seems to be leading to Y? They just don't have they don't have the experience or the education or whatever to be able to unpick it. But I feel that they feel it. Is that happening though in other parts of the world? Is that happening in China? Not sure. Maybe starting in India now, I would say. My colleagues that I know of in India feel that way. Colleagues that I work with in Western Africa feel that way. Um, yeah, I don't
That's
think I've
hopeful.
answered your
I think there's
question.
a no. I mean, I think you're seeing, and I'm just the only point I'm saying is I think it does seem to be something there that a lot of people
Mm,
agree with, and that people could potentially coalesce. Like being radically local might be the thing that a lot of people just would agree with, no matter what their political persuasion is. So,
I did
yeah.
an interview a couple months ago with Jeff McFadden, who writes here on Substack as well. I forget the
Mhm.
name of his publication off the top of my head, but he's the guy who drives his donkeys everywhere.
Yeah. Yeah.
And
He's a champion.
yeah, Jeff's a fascinating guy. And one of the things that he talked about it was just how pretty much every single person who goes by him or who he sees is taking pictures and stopping to talk to him and
Mm,
say, "This is so amazing, and I've always thought,
mm,
we should slow down." And there is this very real sense in which I think many people, even many people whom are huge investors in the stock market and sort of believe at some superficial level, at least, in the magic of technology and progress and innovation and,
mm,
the power of capitalism. Um, I think many of those people, even many of those people, but I think the vast majority of people, probably across the political spectrum, can feel at some level that modernity is not
mm.
making us well, right? That it's just sort of leading to all these different problems throughout the culture, whether it's,
Mm,
in mental health, whether it's in the state of politics, whether it's in ecology, whether it's in democracy, media, discourse, um, just our ability, relationships, families, communities, all these different, every single
mm.
area, it feels like everything's speeding up. And I think everyone feels that and can feel that it's not right. And so I think when people see those
Yeah.
counterexamples from folks like Jeff, um, they feel this sense of relief almost, this lifting of that incessant, treadmill of accumulation and progress and faster and faster and faster. That
Yeah.
we all feel the weight of that. And how to sort of mobilize around that and move people forward around that type of ideal is is certainly more challenging. I've been encouraged to hear about young people organizing these Luddite clubs
Mhm.
recently, which have sprung up across the U.S. and I assume across the world, um, about this sort of resurgence of interest in more analog ways of life and more and more people getting rid of
Mm.
their smartphones and so on. But of course, as I always say on those sorts of topics, the counterpoint is that just as those people are getting rid of their smartphones, there are, I don't know, I'm making up the numbers, but say 1 million people a week in the global south who are getting their first smartphone
Mm.
ever, you know?
Yeah.
And so the net is probably more towards still more digitalization, more incorporation into the machine and so on, despite these sort of individual examples of withdrawal from the system and participating in
Yeah.
alternatives. I mean, I'm sure you know this, Margie, and I know you do too, Justin. Like, it's hard to swim upstream in this culture. I
Mm.
didn't have a smartphone until probably 6 years ago, and I was one of the last holdouts in my group of friends and people my age. There weren't. I was one of the very last who I know who didn't have a smartphone until that recently. And has it made my work easier in some ways? Sure. Has it improved my quality of life? Not at all. It's only made my life worse. And yet, the ability to give it up somehow feels like this mountain, and that's an individual experience. I could give up my smartphone, and um, yet the psychological barrier that exists even in me, somebody who's literally, I spend all my time critiquing technology and production and modernity and industrial civilization, and even still there's this addictive nature of these technologies. There's this momentum that they get, that's very hard to get out from underneath. And
But also you're being pushed into them too. Like,
yeah,
let's not
yeah,
kid around. It's very hard to function without one now. Any interaction, certainly in Australia, I'm quite certain it must be the same in the US. Any interaction with a government agency or, with your utilities bill or whatever, it requires a smartphone. It needs your phone to be able to give you a code.
yeah, yeah,
It's hard.
absolutely. Yeah, yeah. Well, there's one other piece I wanted to throw out there, Margie, just about this sort of community topic, and then maybe we can shift gears. We've been on for an hour now, so I don't know how much time you have, but but in your recent series, you were writing about your partner Jeff, and some
Hmm.
health issues he's been having with his eyes, which
Hmm.
I hope are getting better, or at least stable.
Yeah, they
And
are.
how good. Um, but you're writing about how difficult that's been for you in this growing food, in this sort of cooperative
Mm,
venture that you're doing. I shouldn't call it a venture. This community based food
mm,
growing effort that you're involved in. How challenging that's been, and how you had to go to the group and say, "I need to step back because I need to take care of my partner. He needs me right
yeah,
now. I can't take on this big role that I've been doing here." And
yeah.
I was reminded of a book written by a local author in our area here, Carol DePay, who is a gardener and farmer, and she wrote a book called "The Resilient Gardener: Food Production and Self-Reliance in Uncertain Times." And what I found quite
Hmm.
interesting and appealing about it is that not only does she talk about, ecological collapse and power outages and natural disasters and these sort of large scale, you know, geological or natural or political events that are outside of our power, but also the small things that are happening to our communities, to our families all the time, medical
Mm,
issues, you get injured, your family
mhm.
needs you, whatever the situation is, and you can't take care of the garden. And so
Mm,
her whole book is about how do we prepare for these types of situations, not just the big, but also the small that are happening every year, every season, every month. Um,
yeah.
and in a way, it's like these small disasters are training, or these small challenges are training and practice for the larger challenges that inevitably come. They just happen on less frequent intervals. And I found that quite compelling. And it seems like you're kind of going through a crash course in that in recent months.
Well, I think we are indeed, and I mean there have been other lessons along the way with other parts of our grower collective having difficulties. We've had other weather challenges and things breaking, and we've had other people with health issues, and we've needed to step in and look after things on their behalf. And what it's basically been teaching me along the way is this whole notion of villaging. We have to learn, and this doesn't come immediately. And this is why I'm just so desperate for people to understand. You got to start now. You really need to get into this now because you you have to learn how to be with other people, how to cooperate with other people, how to share um, what's happening in your life with other people. so that they can step in, or they're aware and they will step in when it's needed. Again, it's an atrophied skill. Back when we were tinier communities of people, this would have been self-evident. Someone gets
Yeah.
sick in the village, other people bring food, or they tend to the whatever the contribution that person had in the community would have been dealt with by someone else on a temporary basis, be they the blacksmith or the grower or whatever they were. We don't have those skills anymore. We don't even know our neighbors anymore.
Mhm.
So um, I am now discovering that this takes time. You can't make it happen quickly. You can't have a community meeting and suddenly there's just that intuitive understanding of each other. It takes months and months and months to do. The other thing that I'm really keen for people to understand is that organizing all of the other backup systems around collapse also take time. I mean, one of the projects that Jeff has been leading in our community is setting up a off-grid, 100% off-grid community radio system between many of our properties, so that when towers go down and when mobile phones go down and there's need for us to be in touch, that we are able to use, and we're using the old CB radio system because it's independent of anything. It's independent of any infrastructure. We are the infrastructure. That takes a long time. You know, you can't just make that happen. You have to get things in. Yes, please. You have to get things in. You have to, assess the landscape and make sure that aerials are tall enough. You have to, you have to be able to teach people how to use radios that they don't know how to use. Set up systems for people to be able to work out how to communicate when they need it. So it's not only growing, it's everything,
Mhm.
It's all of these systems need time, and
Yeah.
we don't have much time,
Mhm.
right? When we look at what's being shown to us through the most conservative of government agencies in the world, the defense agencies. I mean, when we see this information coming out, where even they are saying we are at that existential point where things are going to go bad. Um, we've got a decade, probably not more than that, before big things start to happen. Even putting the ridiculous wars aside, just with what's going on with climate change, we've got a decade really before hardships are going to start to grip some communities, not all, not everyone homogeneously across the world, but some communities. And I just feel like because we don't know where it will hit, it behoves everyone to get working now to figure out how they're going to operate in a village now, even if they still have to maintain their 9 to 5 job, keep their technology going, do all of those things. It's almost like we've got this other project that needs to be happening underneath it all.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, completely, and I think that I mean, the truth is it's already hitting the most vulnerable communities around the world. We were talking about the small island states
Yeah.
earlier, and,
Yeah.
some of the smallest and lowest of the low-lying islands in the Pacific have already had to be evacuated, in the Indian Ocean and elsewhere, have already had to be
Yeah.
evacuated, and, that's ethnic cleansing. That's the definition
It is.
of ethnic cleansing, removing people from their land. Or you look at Pakistan and the floods that have been
Mm,
hitting them repeatedly in recent years. You look at
mm,
the Philippines and the typhoons, more powerful than ever, just hammering the Philippines, one after another in recent seasons. There are so many examples. The droughts that have been hitting parts of East Africa. There are hundreds of thousands, if not millions, of people who are losing their homes, losing their livelihoods, being driven out of the areas where they live, becoming refugees, being injured or being killed right now every year due to global warming and more broadly to the ecological crisis,
Yeah.
of which global warming is sort of a subset in my view. And it's only going to be accelerating more and more. But I certainly agree that in the global north, in these places where we're much more insulated from those realities, largely because of the infrastructural systems, the military systems, and so on that serve people, privileged people in the global north like me, whether we like it or not, just because we live here, that's the reality of it. A friend of mine used to say, we live behind a military barricade in the global north, and we can never forget that. And yeah, outside of that barricade, things are grim, pretty grim already. And when I went to the Philippines a number of years ago, what I saw was a lot of solidarity work. Talking with my friends down there, the activists who are doing work down there, they do a lot of solidarity work, a lot of mutual aid work. It's villaging, it's community based. It's all about surviving together because there is no individual survival in these contexts. And the other thing I just wanted to say, and then sorry, I'll shut up because Justin probably has more to say too. But the other thing I'll say is that I think the village, the community that's established, the relationships that are built in creating these alternatives to these industrial systems, they're also incredibly valuable for resistance work. And I view resistance and resilience as really two sides of the same process taking place. They're two sides of people adapting to a new reality, recognizing that the old way isn't serving us anymore. And not only do we need to prepare for it to come down, we need to actively bring it down as we replace it. And I think that looks a lot of different ways, but those networks, one thing that you'll find throughout, militaries around the world, for example, is that you talk to soldiers and they don't tell you, I'm fighting for the United States because I love the USA and rah, rah, rah. They'll tell you, I'm fighting for the guy next to me. I'm fighting for my buddy in the unit, and that's the reality in resistance movements too. Again, I mentioned the hurling and the Irish resistance, and it's the reality around the world as well. One example from fiction, but from a rural, somewhat conservative farming community, is the film Woman at War, which is just a delightful film. If you haven't seen it already, I definitely recommend it, Margie. It's an Icelandic film, and it takes place, the story is this woman who sabotages electrical infrastructure because, Iceland is being increasingly industrialized for geothermal power. There's all these giant aluminum smelters there. There's increasingly tons of data centers. All the geothermal power creates tons of acid rain and releases all these heavy metals and so on. Geothermal is not green by any stretch of the imagination. But a lot of heavy industry goes to Iceland because the power's cheap. And so she's sabotaging the oil industry. And at one point she's running and trying to get away from some police, and a local farmer helps her out. And he says something like, "Oh yeah, I think my grandpa knew your grandpa," something along those lines, and that's a moment where it's fiction again, but this is the reality in resistance movements and community movements, social movements throughout history, is that community is more powerful than politics, and in many cases. And what you'll see is that relationships are more powerful than political alignments. And that's why sort of these quote unquote communities that we see arising online of people whose only connection is that they share some opinions on controversial political topics, they're very shallow, they're very fragile. The relationships are essentially ephemeral and non-existent. Whereas if your grandfather ran sheep with somebody else's grandfather, that's a connection that means something, right? There's some level of obligation inherent in that. Because what it probably means is that when, your father got sick and, that other person's mother made extra stew and brought it over and helped them get through a difficult time when maybe it was tuberculosis or something back in the day. Like, community is life and death when you're living on the land and when you're living closer to subsistence, which is really how we all should be living and how everyone used to live if they're not still. And that bond is incredibly powerful.
But it takes a long time to form, and so you can't just expect that you can hold a street party and it will be there. You have to invest in it, and it takes a good lot of commitment to form it. But once it's formed, it's like a rock.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely.
Well, I think it's important to note that dismantling community, I think, has been a very intentional thing that for lack of a better way to say it, the empire or those who benefit the most from the status quo have implemented. They've done this on purpose. They've destroyed community. They've sought to isolate people. And, thinking about the Great Depression, just as an example, people were bartering. They started bartering things. I grow this, you might grow that, or you might be able to fix that, and then start trading. And businesses started complaining because people weren't buying stuff anymore. And so they literally made bartering illegal in some places. They put the kibosh on these kinds of things. Even though there was sort of an encouragement of resilience and things like that, but going back to like Ireland or Vietnam, that's one of the reasons I think the powers that be know that resilience and the ability to grow your own food and not have to depend on the empire is the most powerful thing that we have, along with community. And so I think they've done everything they could to just dismantle it or make it not happen. And it's possible that social media and phones are a part of that. But I don't know. I mean, I think if, let's say the governments of the planet here in the United States, for example, if the state, local, and federal governments all kind of were building up to preparing for what's coming, like they were before World War II or something, and they put every effort into making sure that people were building community or being resilient on growing food, it would probably happen relatively quickly. I think it could happen in a matter of years.
Yeah.
But the biggest challenge, and I don't know what the answer is, I'd love to hear anyone's opinion on this, is, without that, and we're just doing this on our own volition, like, is that something that can happen, or and how? Big question.
Well, it's very challenging, and I was just reading something yesterday about Bernie Sanders, who's a left-wing politician. He's probably the most left-wing member of the Senate in the U.S. and ran for president and Democratic Socialist and so on. And he was talking about data centers and the problems posed by this massive explosion in data center construction. And his proposal for moving forward is for the government to take a 50% stake in AI companies so that the government can cast, controlling votes essentially, as the main shareholder. And the critique of that is, of course, that this creates perverse incentives, because when you're invested in the industry, then you want the industry to succeed, because the more it succeeds, the more money the government gets, just like any other investor. All of a sudden, there's a big conflict of interest between government regulation and the success of a business or the profitability of a business. Of course, that conflict of interest is already in full effect, through the revolving door, through unlimited money in political campaigns, through lobbying, through all the rights that corporations have in the American legal system, which are probably paralleled in Australia, I imagine, as well.
Mm.
Um,
Mhm.
uh, but it was just interesting to me because it illustrates how far away we are from where even the most progressive candidates in the United States, the most progressive politicians, uh, have really nothing to offer in terms of like a degrowth-oriented political vision. Their best offering is essentially a capitalism with socialist characteristics type system, maybe similar to what they have in China, which uh, is producing a ton of prosperity in China at the cost of ecological devastation, at the cost of China being the number one carbon emitter in the world for many years, at the cost of China, building at full speed ahead every energy source it can get its hands on, because they need so much power to continue the growth machine. Um, China's an ecological disaster in my view for the world, and of course it's not. It would be simplistic to say it's entirely their fault, because for most of China's history as a modern nation, they were very much sort of having to respond to outside capitalist pressures and so on. But nonetheless, I think people who look at China as sort of an ecological paradigm for future ecological civilization are unfortunately deluding themselves. Um, but yeah, we don't really see that viable political movement anywhere in the world. It's really on the fringes, and very simplistically, it's sort of simple to understand this. If you're willing to cut down your forest and sell it to make money, then you're going to be rich, and if you're not willing to do that, then you're going to be poor. And
Mm.
that's why all the people who want to defend the land are poor, and all the people who want to destroy the land are rich, and money is power in our society. That's sort of like summing up our
Yeah.
problem in two sentences, right? Um,
Well, that's it.
but
It's pretty good.
yeah, but
Yeah.
how do
And
we get
and
around that?
and by pulling it
Please.
down. Well,
Yeah.
I think we can't. I think the notion of reforming it is just, it's a time past. It could have reformed 40 years ago maybe, but it's a time past now. It's so pervasive. Certainly in the international work that I did for a long time, it was everywhere. Absolutely everywhere. In every single sentence on the page was business. Underneath every single word was a monetary metric. Every single time. Morals were not there. Community was not there. It was always the metric of money is power. And I mean, I would love to believe that it can be reformed. I would love to believe that sort of a utopic world can be created with a sane and just governance system, but I personally don't believe anymore that it can. I think what is there has to be pulled down. And out of that will be rebuilt something new, I hope. But it's certainly in my lifetime, because I'm not a youngster, it has to be pulled down. And that I don't predict seeing it reform while I'm still breathing. Yeah.
Yeah.
Sad, but that's the time we're in, I think.
It's sad, but it's also
And
freeing, isn't it?
it is, but that's why the radical or the rebellion um, ethic is so important right now. Like it doesn't mean, again, you don't have to do something scary or frightening. You don't have to stand in front of a military blockade and threaten yourself. But there is a lot of radicalism that you can be doing, and even empowering, embracing that word again would be wonderful, rather than it being supercharged and changed into something that it's not.
It's like radish,
Rebellion is
right? Like
important.
it's the root.
Mhm.
Radical
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, it
means
is.
get to the roots of the problem, like a radish.
That's right. And it also happens to be peppery and hot. So there you go.
Yeah. Another
Little butter in the
similarity.
sauce.
Yeah, I love a good radish, fresh radish.
Mm.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, I totally agree, Margie. I think you're absolutely right. I mean that these systems have proven themselves over and over and over and over again to be incapable of reform. And
Mm.
I still support some efforts that people do in those arenas simply because I think they prevent things from getting worse faster than they would otherwise,
Yeah,
right?
sure.
There's amazing
Yeah.
defensive work being done within these systems, whether it's people who are defending democracy or defending environmental protection laws, or working at local level to challenge endless urban sprawl, or whatever the different ways that people work within these systems are. I think there's value in at least, at the very
Mm.
least, some of that work. Um,
Yeah.
but I'm very much drawn towards these systems are doomed, and that's actually a good thing. And
Yeah.
the sooner they fall, the better in the long term everyone and everything on this planet will be. And there's a lot of
Yeah.
complexities in that. Justin and I have talked a lot in our previous live streams about how when we
Mm.
talk about collapse, it's a complex, massive process that involves a lot of different factors. Some elements of
Mm.
collapse could be said to be good things, like reductions in global warming, reductions in species extinctions, reductions in the amount of land being destroyed. Um, all these things could be seen as positive impacts of collapse related to the collapse of global industrial economies.
Yeah.
But then there are negative impacts, things like, potential for starvation, breakdown in the ability for people to get the basic necessities of life, um, rising fascism and authoritarianism around the world, people sort of appealing back to these patriarchal father figures, domineering
Yeah.
father figures too, whether it's,
Yeah.
it's Trump or it's Bibi Netanyahu, or it's all these different figures around the world who just represent this sort of, this sort of domineering, violent father figure who some
Yeah.
people feel like can protect them because that was the model they got in childhood, or I don't know what. That's their vision of the world.
Mm.
Um, you know, those aspects. How do we slow those? How do we mitigate those? How do we stop those? And this to me is the real meat of the work, and it's so fascinating to hear from you a little bit more about your work
Mm.
in that arena, which is really related to that first point that I mentioned around starvation and food security in the face of this ongoing polycrisis catastrophe.
But also, I think to mitigate all of that, those negative impacts, we all have to come up with more robust ways of looking after each other. We need to rebuild our skills to be able to work as groups, diverse
Mm,
groups with disagreement.
mm,
And it sounds so soft and so kumbaya, but it's not. It is really, really hard, and
mm,
it needs more writers. It needs more talkers. It needs more of our attention. And I would love to pull the environment movement into this more as well, rather than this sort of hopium overlay that exists in so much of the mainstream environment space. To really looking at what collapse means for nature and for communities close to nature, and finding ways for the community to become protectors of
mhm,
the nature that's near them,
mhm,
rather than this notion of put a fence around it and it will be well, because actually it won't.
mm,
Um, Natural disasters don't know anything about fences or boundaries or laws. They don't care. You know, fires run right through everything. Um, and if the community isn't bonded to that, if the community doesn't see that as part of the extension of their village, then nature comes out very poorly.
Yeah. We've got some questions coming in the chat. I asked folks to drop questions in there if they had them, and I'd be curious what you two think of some of these topics. I'll throw in one myself, which maybe we can just defer to a later conversation, because honestly, it may be one of those topics where we disagree on, or maybe, maybe it's something that we agree to not talk about in this context to model the behavior that we were talking about earlier. But it's about fire specifically. I've been doing a lot of reading lately, especially a fire ecologist, Dr. Chad Hansen, who works here mostly in the Western U.S. Do you know Chad Hansen's work? Okay, yeah. So then maybe we're on the same page. But a lot of his focus is about how we have this fear of fire, and that fire is an essential and healthy component of forest ecosystems, grassland ecosystems, shrub ecosystems. That it's not only natural, but it's incredibly important to these landscapes to burn, and even to burn intensely. That's a point that he makes, is that often people talk about low intensity fire as if it's good fire, and high intensity fire as if it's bad fire, it's catastrophic. And he says that nature doesn't really make that distinction, that even what we think of as catastrophic wildfire that kills all the trees is in most cases a natural phenomenon. Of course, layered on top of that, you have the reality of global warming, extreme fire weather increasing, and then the reality that, at least in the US, I believe it's 9 out of 10 fires are started by people, not by, lightning or some sort of natural ignition. And so there's an interplay between that. And of course, you mentioned a history of fire suppression on the island where you live. That sort of complexifies the situation even more. So maybe that will be a conversation for another time, sort of to dive into fire ecology and fire return intervals, and how we think about fire as being at the same time, from a human perspective, a natural disaster, but from an ecological perspective, often a force of renewal and rebirth and regeneration. But again, that is complexified because so much of the land has been degraded that, there's not that much healthy land left, right?
Yeah. I would love to talk about this. I would adore to talk about this. And, it's just something that I've researched a lot since the wildfire hit us. And but just to reassure you, actually, we are in unanimous agreement. What I would add, though, is just a layer about how our land use has impacted now what is an escalating, changing climate impact on fire. And so what is an intense fire, according to the fire ecologists, is now being eclipsed, especially in the Australian landscape, beyond any scale that fire has been seen before, because of so much historical suppression, because of boundaries where that suppression happened. And so you get these immense areas of fuel load that just go up and make just unearthly fire. It's intense. But fire is absolutely natural, and fire needs to be in the landscape, especially all the way across the Australian landscape. But it's a really detailed conversation, and I would love to have it at another time. Yeah.
Yeah, that sounds good. Well, either of you, do you want to tackle any of these questions that folks have been putting in? Phil asked about financial collapse. Angus asked about the Dunbar number concept. Any thoughts on those?
Yeah, let's start with Phil's question and go from there. Like, anyone who wants to answer each of them, jump in. I wanted to say, with financial collapse, the stock market is obviously like one of the biggest returns that people will get for investment. But yeah, we don't know what the future of that is, right? So, my thought is, if you invest in things that will give you the ability to be like sustainable, or resilient, like land that has access to water, and then any assets or commodities or whatever that would then further your ability to grow food and to protect yourself and things like that. So
Mhm.
that's my take on that one.
Full
Yeah,
agreement. Full
yeah,
agreement.
the
I
only
think investing outside the system is a good
Mhm.
idea.
Yeah.
Mm.
Yeah, and I think, if you get back to sort of the roots of the investment idea, we think of investment in this modern concept of buying stocks on the stock market in corporations or buying an index fund or something like that. But the original idea was simply, you have extra and you give it to someone else and they agree that they'll give you some
Mm.
extra back in afterwards. So maybe you're investing in, one of your neighbors or your friends who's got a project going on,
Mm.
some sort of, uh, you know, there's whether it's actually a monetary project like a small business, or maybe it's an ecological project, an organizing project, an activism project. Maybe the return isn't money, maybe it's something else.
Mm.
So, obviously everyone's financial situation is going to be difficult or different rather. And there are a lot of people who don't have retirement money, don't have money to invest. And so the question is sort of moot. It's not where do I put my money, it's what money. um,
Yeah.
and so these are broader systemic issues, but it's something that I've written about before, how the stock market and the fact
Mm.
that we've moved into, in the US at least, a situation where people's uh, retirement revolves around their ability to survive when they're old and can't work anymore, revolves around corporate power, increasing corporate power essentially. And this is a Faustian bargain. It's golden handcuffs. It's whatever analogy you want to make.
Mm.
It's a very dangerous situation where that kind of creates the Stockholm syndrome. And
Yeah.
it's ironic to me that so many people who are working to change the system, change the world, challenge capitalism, have large amounts of money tied up in the stock market. And that's putting your efforts, your money, which represents your energy, or perhaps your
Yeah.
family's previous energy and so on, into that system. And I don't have the perfect answer to escape that, but it certainly doesn't sit right with me at all. Um, but yeah, someone mentioned buying land, um, conserving land, protecting land. I mean, it's something that I'm. I mean, the organization that I work for, Seldif, is trying to raise money right now. Um, I'm involved in this land protection effort where we're trying to potentially buy a square mile of old growth forest from a logging company in Northern California, and that might cost $1 million, and I don't have
Mm.
I don't have $1 million. I make I'm supporting my family. My partner just got laid off, and I'm supporting my family on like a part-time nonprofit job with a crappy salary and no benefits. So um,
Yeah.
so I also hope that if people have extra, that they'll invest it into people, groups, movements that are doing resistance work and protecting land, and those who are doing resilience work, and into their own resilience and community.
Full agreement with both of you guys, but what both of you have all written as well historically, because I read both of you every time. The only thing I would add as an overlay is just sort of more specifically, if you're concerned about investing to protect your future, right, and you're seeing the protection of your future as being a monetary return that you get equivalent to a salary, start looking at your life um, with a different lens and find ways that you might be able to protect your future by operating outside a system that requires money. So growing your own food is a very obvious thing, but there are many, many other things about learning skills to be able to repair things, or creating a network of people who can do an action together, do a function together that would be something that you would ordinarily have to buy or pay for. And it doesn't actually take much. Once you've started to your thought process in this direction, you right. And I don't know if I just went away there for a moment, but
You're
yeah,
back.
operating outside of money. Yeah, sorry about that. So just look at your life and see how you can operate outside of the monetary system. And that doesn't even take a monetary investment often. It just takes a mindset investment.
Yeah.
Hmm.
Yeah. Yeah. And I wanted to mention earlier, I think this whole piece about, Justin was talking about the deliberate destruction of community earlier. And I think that's very related to what
Mm.
you were just saying, Margie. She's having problems with connection,
Oh,
but
sorry.
it's okay. It's okay. It really seems linked to the enclosure.
They heard we were talking about them, so they started to mess with their internet.
That's right.
They heard us. Uh,
At least I know. Now
yeah.
I know what it looks like when someone drops out. Anyway.
There he is. He's back. I said they heard we were talking,
Yeah.
so they started messing with their
Yeah.
internet.
I moved a little closer. How's that? Can you guys hear me okay?
That's good. Yeah.
Perfect.
I think there's a connection between these topics when it comes to the enclosure of the commons, because I live in the Western United States,
Mm.
and one thing that is really great about the Western U.S. is that there is a commons, which is the National
Mm.
Forest Land, the BLM, Bureau of Land Management lands, and other public lands that anyone can go out onto, can camp on, can hunt on, can fish on, can gather edible foods, can gather mushrooms, can gather plants for various purposes. There's obviously critiques that can be made of this land ownership system and its colonial origins and dispossession of indigenous peoples and so on. But nonetheless, there are many places around the world where there is no public land. There is no commons left. It's all been privatized. And
Yeah.
the closest thing to a commons that remains is a sidewalk on the street, which is why the homeless people, are there, because it's literally
Yeah.
the only place where they can be. Um, and that's the case in most U.S. cities. But access to land is really everything in the end, and it's survival. It's the difference between survival and not. And so I think that depending on the amount of money that people have available, I think uh, thinking about land is really important, and not just land in a sort of individual survival sense, but in a sense of community survival and ecosystem survival and biosphere survival. Um, Humans are animals. We're just like any other animal. We need habitat. We need specific types of habitat, just like a bear does, or a bumblebee, or a great blue heron, or a salmon. Right? We need specific habitat niches in order to survive. And I think that especially when those places are threatened by logging or mining or uh, housing developments or urban sprawl or industrial agriculture or whatever different threat it is, the more that we can protect those niches, both for the human animal and for other creatures, I think that's really, really important in this time. So that's, I think, related to this topic too.
Yeah, and I did know someone here locally that has made agreements with people who do own land for them to be able to, you know, build shelter and live on private land. So if you, that's one way to do it without any money. So you don't necessarily have to have a bunch of money to do things differently, to live outside the system. I mean, it's not. I'm not saying it's easy. I don't personally do that myself. So because of my circumstances, but I'd like to do more things like that. I don't have a lot of money to buy land, so I spend some of my time learning the skills that would be needed to, somewhat live off the land, and then I would love to learn more about growing food as well. But I try to, participate in local growth of food, that kind of thing.
Mhm.
And then Angus asked a question about, if that's okay to go to this next question, about with respect to community approaches to resilience, does the Dunbar number concept have value? If so, doesn't that suggest that our future hinges on many, many small is beautiful clusters of human settlement? And I know Margie mentioned that earlier, which is that, so basically, like, we have to learn how to make villages.
Mhm.
And I did want to mention um, a couple of things. One is, you know, I've written about the Kurdish people because I've found learning about different governance systems, one of the best ones I've seen from the Kurdish people and from the Zapatistas in Mexico, or kind of an indigenous group of people. But in the Kurdish folks in Syria who have an autonomous region, it's inside a nation state, but they are an autonomous region that govern themselves. And the way they do that is they start at the bottom. They call it a bottom-up system of democracy. So it starts with a neighborhood.
Yeah.
That's the first unit.
Mm.
So I would think of a neighborhood as kind of being like a village. That's so I think that is the core unit, kind of like a cell in human biology. And then you work up from there. I like the idea of bioregionalism, which is, you look at a watershed or a bioregion as being sort of a, a form of identity. And it might be more of a regional, it's a larger area, but we might have more in common here in the Pacific Northwest with folks in Washington and British Columbia, maybe even parts of Alaska in the Panhandle, than we do with, folks down in the Mojave Desert or in California, Southern California specifically. So when you start to think of breaking the world down and ecologically, and how those different groups of people might live differently, their habitat, like Max was saying, might be a little bit different. And so it might call for different approaches. And so I think those are ways of thinking about things, to answer Angus's question, that we should start thinking about things from the bottom up. And I think that's where you organize from. I think a lot of these NGOs and environmental movements and stuff have all taken this top down kind of approach to organizing and political activism. I think that may be part of the failure.
Mhm.
I
Yeah.
agree. And in fact, the UN many, many years ago, 30 years ago or whatever, did quite a lot of work around that. And there were a number of academics that came to the space. And this is where the bioregional concept came from, or was born of. But looking at how governance is better performed from a an ecological perspective than the lines from that we have right now. I'll just keep chatting while Max comes back. But um, the important thing is that the unit, whether it's Dunbar or slightly smaller or slightly bigger, the unit needs to be big enough at the base for there to be proper collaboration between people to develop enough understanding. But I'm 100% with you that bioregionally, that those smaller units should probably come together
Mhm.
in something that's bioregional.
Yeah.
I think it makes more sense for the future. But
Mhm.
this kind of circles back to the conversation we were having half an hour ago or whatever about the big system. And I just can't see the big system, not the least of which because the environment movement won't adapt, but the big system adapting to that. I think it has to come down and then be rebuilt in the
Mm,
same way the Kurds was maintained. That was their historical system that they now withhold. They're hanging on to that fiercely, rightly, because it's a good one. Yeah.
mm. Yeah, well said, both of you. Well, Margie and Justin, I hate to do this because the conversation feels great, but I have to get going. I gotta do some childcare here, but, I really appreciate you both taking the time to do this. It's a great conversation. We should definitely get together again and dive into sort of the next set of topics that we didn't get to, because there's certainly more in my notes that we didn't get to dive into, and the unfortunate reality, of course, is this crisis is not going away. It's here to stay. So there's a
Plenty to
lot of
talk
work
about.
to do. And yeah, and I really appreciate Margie just getting to meet you in this way and getting to learn from you and share some of your knowledge. So thanks for getting up early and joining
It's
us. I
been
appreciate it.
it's my pleasure. It's been fantastic, and I feel quite honoured to be part of this thing you've created.
Mm.
I love what you guys are doing, and I love these conversations. I enjoy. You usually are on in my wash pack shed once I've done my harvest and I'm cleaning carrots. I've got you guys on in the background, so
Nice.
it's a thrill to be here. Thank you so much.
Thank
Thank
you.
you. Okay, Margie, Justin, thanks very much. Thanks everyone for watching. We'll see you soon.
Thanks, y'all.